Warning, the voices heard in this video are made synthetically using artificial intelligence. Nothing in this video reflects anything actually stated by the real-life individuals involved. This video is for entertainment purposes only, and serious political content will be avoided for that purpose. Enjoy!
Hello viewers, and welcome to my Donald Trump's Dragon Age Awakening playthrough. Let's get right into it, shall we?
Donald, actually, I just got a text from our editor. He says he is going on a vacation next week and won't have time to edit Awakening for a few weeks.
So everyone is screwing me for the 10th time? What the hell are we supposed to do today in the White House that I'm already in a Dragon Age mood?
Well, good news, boys. I finally did my mage playthrough with all the free time I've had since dropping out of re-election, and our editor filled in the gaps with one of his own mage playthroughs. So we have plenty of notes here to do the magic spell tier list finally.
Sounds good, boys. We can finally be a proper YouTube channel. Now let's get it.
Fine, I can be a man of the people here. Let's do this. So here's how this is gonna go. Put Holy Smite and Cleanse Area in S tier and everything else in C tier. Actually, wait, put Fireball in S tier too, then it's perfect.
Donald, Templar abilities are not spells. They won't be on this list. We are going to rank everything in the base game, an Awakening expansion that the mage class can unlock, including the specializations. Do you want to get into how the rankings work, Barry?
With pleasure, Joe. So obviously we have two main criteria in mind. When ranking the spells, the first is obvious and the most important, which is how good they are at the highest difficulty in Dragon Age Origins. We also factor in cooldown times and casting times and many other little things when reviewing a spell. The second criteria is how many skill points it takes to unlock this ability, since mages will only get so many talent points in the game. For example, Sure Chain Lightning is a good ability. It hits every enemy on the field with no friendly fire, but it does take 4 talent points to unlock, and we have to factor if it is worth it to invest that many points. This also means the first level spells in a tree are under less scrutiny and can get a buff in the rankings if their ability is useful, while only costing 1 talent point.
Thanks for the yap, Barack. I almost fell asleep there. Why don't we start with the specializations, since those are at the top anyway, and they have a slightly different rule in that we have to factor that it costs one of our 2 specialization points or 3 in Awakening to unlock the specialization, and that means we have to consider how good the others are when ranking them.
That seems like a good place to start. Well, first in the row we have Arcane Warrior. This specialization is all about buffing your mage's physical attack with your spell power and keeping them alive. The first spell in this list is Combat Magic. It's an active spell that gives the mage an increased +5 attack, plus adding your spell power modifier to attacks. However, the buff only works on strength-based weapons, so bows, crossbows, and daggers are unaffected.
Yeah, that's the boring shit. The real reason to pick up this spell and this specialization as a whole is as soon as you grab it, your mage can now wear any type of armor, replacing the strength requirement for armor with magic score. This fully replaces the main weakness your mage has, which is their squishiness, to now become a decent tank in your squad.
This does sacrifice the benefits that robes give your mage, namely mana regeneration. However, the defense bonus is usually always worth it at higher levels. I recommend getting this specialization and ability later in your game, not at level 7, when you only have access to tier 3 and 4 armor. Find a late game set with good defenses, like Wade's Dragon Bone Plate or Juggernaut armor, then grab this ability. Still, while the first half of this ability is just okay, the ability to wear armor makes this an easy S tier spell.
Starting off with the S tier is crazy, but I agree.
Next up we have Aura of Might, a passive ability. This improves Combat Magic's attack bonus, nearly doubling your melee attack damage bonus, while also giving you a +10 to defense while in Combat Magic, which is a decent buff.
Not much to say, it's just a nice little stat buff. But it is important to note that even though you can use melee weapons with this ability doesn't mean you should. Using a melee weapon means that you will have to sheath your sword every time you cast a spell. Depending on your build, this can greatly slow down your total damage personally. I say just stick to the magic stick, lil bro, and wield your heavy armor to protect yourself.
There is one sword, Spellweaver, that is supposed to be able to be used as a staff, but several spells still will sheath your sword, so either build around this which can get tedious, or just equip a staff and forego the attack bonus. Either way, this spell is a solid B tier. The defense makes it good, but an increase to attack comes with a risk to your spell DPS.
B tier it goes then. Next we have Shimmering Shield, another active spell. This spell gives you maximum resistance, which is 75% to all elemental damage, and maximum physical and mental resistance as well. It also gives you an extra 15 armor and a blowjob from a Desire Demon, because why not?
As colorful as Joe phrased it here, the point is this spell gives you more value than almost any other spell in the game, making you resistant to any damage an enemy can throw at you. The cost of all this is that it drains your mana rapidly while using this ability, and if your mana is empty, the spell ends. However, you can actually find enough ways to balance out this mana drain with the last talent in this tree, and the right mana regeneration items like Kalian's Sword and Shield, as well as Wade's Dragon Bone Plate, to make it so you don't lose any mana while this ability is active.
This is the second reason why Arcane Warrior is overpowered. Throwing a Shimmering Shield on your mage while wearing a Tier 7 heavy armor makes your mage a better tank than most Sword and Shield warriors. This allows you to almost solo anything on Nightmare except for the hardest bosses in easy S tier.
If there was a tier higher than S tier, this spell would qualify. Last spell is another passive Fade Shroud. It gives you extra mana regeneration when combat magic is active. This is a +1 in combat and a +2 out of combat.
Pretty basic on its own, but this helps keep Shimmering Shield up, and mana is the name of the game, so I would say it's A tier.
If this didn't pair with Shimmering, I would give it a C tier since it's a lame capstone, but mana regeneration is important, so A tier it is.
Sounds good, boys. Next specialization we have is Shapeshifter. This specialization allows you to shapeshift like a druid into 3 different forms: a spider, a bear, and a swarm of bugs. However, your mage can't cast any spells while shifted and only gets about 2 or 3 abilities in each form. While the forms are cool, this means your mage is no longer even a mage. And worst of all, you have to give up a specialization point that you could have used for any other specialization. So in the interest of time, let's just cover all 3 of these forms at once. First off is the spider form.
Spiders is on.
All right, the arachnophobia, Joe, you good?
Yeah, sorry, I jump scared myself. Just gonna look at my notes instead of the screen. The spider gives max nature resistance, but a weakness to fire, and gives you the ability to spit poison and web enemies, and gives you Overwhelm with a master shapeshifter. This is a D tier. Overwhelm is okay, but if you wanted to use that, just bring the dog. And nature resistance doesn't come up much in the game, but fire comes up all the time.
Next up we have the bear form, but unlike Baldur's Gate 3, we don't get a Halsin sex scene with Mommy Morrigan, which is a massive L.
Do I even need to say
This
it?
form gives you some extra armor and a constitution buff, which can make you pretty tanky and gives you Rage, Slam, and Overwhelm with Master Shifter. This is probably the best form out of the bunch since it makes you tanky, but even that doesn't save it from D tier. If you want your mage to be tanky, take Arcane Warrior.
Last up, we have Flying Swarm, which acts a little differently than the others. You become a swarm of bugs, and instead of active abilities, you passively deal nature damage in the area your swarm is located. And with Master Shapeshifter, you gain lifesteal damage equal to the damage you deal. The swarm also gives you full dodge chance to projectiles, since you can't really shoot a fly with an arrow, but reduces your fire resistance by 75%, so a fireball will straight up kill you. Flying Swarm also doubles your movement speed, which is convenient and can be used for some speed running glitches, but other than that, it's still D tier.
Finally, Master Shapeshifter just improves all your forms and gives them an extra ability and a stronger form, but this doesn't save the specialization from being bottom of the barrel. While sure, this can be fun and thematic to use compared to every other specialization, this one is terrible. Don't use this unless you're playing on normal or easy difficult and want to roleplay. Next up we have Spirit Healer, which is the support specialization focused on healing. The first ability in this specialization is Group Heal. This spell heals every party member at once by a percentage based on your spell power.
This spell makes Spirit Healer worth it on its own. It's one of the few spells that can heal party members, and unlike normal heal, you can heal everyone in the party. The only downside is a longer cooldown than a normal heal.
A simple but pretty good spell, usually in longer fights. Everyone is going to be damaged. This is a high A tier, honestly.
I think A tier is fair. It's really useful, but it doesn't completely define a fight like a S tier spell should. Revive, on the other hand, is an easy S tier. It revives fallen party members and allies in a small circle, and is the only way to do so before a fight ends, besides using Stin's Prayers for the Dead from the Feast Day Party Gifts DLC.
This easily can save battles. Reviving a tank or a key damage dealer halfway through a fight is clutch, making this spell the best get-out-of-jail-free card in the game.
Really, dying is just a skill issue, but if your game is rigged by Democrats, it can be really handy, no objections. S tier is a good place.
Thank you, 5 Deaths, Donald, for your opinion on skill issues. Next up, we have Lifeward, which is essentially an auto-heal. You can cast it on anyone you want, and when they fall to 1/3, their health, the spell auto-heals them by 100 plus. Your spell power times 30%. This does add up at later levels, and it's nice that you can throw it on someone you want to keep alive and then not worry about them.
This spell ironically works through effects that reduce healing, namely blood magic, which does buff it up a few tiers. This again isn't anything crazy, but it's a nice quality of life improvement for healers all the same.
I think A tier is a safe place for Lifeward. It's not as good as group heal, but it is substantial. Last up, we have Cleansing Aura, which is another active ability. This spell sends out a healing pulse that heals 30 health points plus 30% of your spell power every 5 seconds. The spell also cures any injuries your party has.
This spell has the same mana drain as Shimmering Shield and ends when you run out of mana. Again, there are ways you can supplement this mana cost with the right build, but honestly, the healing isn't good enough in normal fights to just leave this on to drain all your mana. There are 2 niche uses where this spell becomes more useful, and that's during the Redcliffe Undead fight to keep all the villagers alive, and the Battle of Denerim to keep your army alive. However, 2 uses is not really enough to give it a higher ranking on its own.
I almost never use this except to heal injuries after a fight. That way I can just sell all my injury kits for extra money. This is the most mid of the abilities in this tree, but it's not terrible. I would say B tier again. Man, the specialization capstones really needed to step up their game. I think every single one so far has just been decent.
I can agree with a B tier this time. Our last of the original specializations is Blood Mage. This spell is all about strong damage and crowd control at the cost of the caster's own health. First up, we have Blood Magic, which is an active ability. You need to activate this to use any other spell in the Blood Mage tree first. And while this spell is active, any spell you cast uses health instead of mana at a 20% reduced cost. This can be dropped all the way to 35% with awakening buffs or an item that improves blood magic.
The cost for this is that healing is now reduced by over 90% from all sources except Lifeward and Blood Sacrifice, which ignores this effect. This is the definition of high risk, high reward, but at high levels, there is really no need to use this as a supplement for mana, since mana potions should be incredibly easy to come by.
Honestly, you're a filthy heretic for using this specialization since it is objectively evil, but if you do just throw out the specific blood mage spells you want to use and turn it off, so your mage doesn't unalive themselves by throwing out too many fireballs with their blood, I'd say this is our first C tier on its own. It doesn't do anything other than allow you to use spells at less cost. And just because it lets you use other abilities that are strong on its own, it doesn't matter.
I agree with C tier, but Donald, you literally gave Morrigan this specialization yourself in our last playthrough.
Mommy Morrigan is above the law. You can't understand her grind.
All right. Well, next up we have Blood Sacrifice, which tries to counter the anti-heal blood magic offers. This spell takes a portion of a ally's health up to 50, then doubles it as healing to your blood mage, up to 100. Important to note, this doesn't work on Shale since she doesn't have blood.
Honestly, I almost never use this spell at high levels. When your tank will have over 300 HP, it's okay, but honestly, 9 out of 10 times it's better to turn off blood magic. and heal with a potion or spell or use Lifeward, if you really want to keep blood magic up for some reason.
This is not being a homie, it's almost a damn negative since you're taking health away from a possibly more durable party member for a mage who is going to lose that health more quickly. I would say this is D tier.
D tier is fair. I almost never use it, but here we have a spell that is a contender for the strongest spell in the game, Blood Wound. Blood Wound causes all enemies in a large radius to take 100 spirit damage, plus your spell power over time. And this causes them to be stunned while taking the damage unless they pass a resistance check, which is really high. Even bosses aren't immune to this ability.
The range is even larger than Fireball and is big enough to hit everyone in the battlefield with just a few exceptions. The best part is this spell has 0 friendly fire damage or effects, which means while everyone is held in place, your party can finish the fight, which means one spell can quite literally end the fight itself. The only weakness of this spell is creatures that don't have blood are immune to this spell, which is undead, demons, and golems. The former two are fairly common enemies, but still 8 out of 10 times this should be the first spell you cast in a fight.
Even I am guilty of using this spell to easy clear an encounter. Thank God only 1 or 2 enemies can even use this ability themselves, since clearing out a room of enemies with no friendly fire is easy. Goddamn money. Even I can't argue with S tier.
Just like Shimmering Shield, if there was a higher than S tier Blood Wound, would be in it. Finally, we have Blood Control, which is a single target spell that can control an enemy unless they pass a resistance check or don't have blood. The enemy is then our ally for 20 seconds, and they take spirit damage equal to blood wounds. Spirit damage during that duration, even if they pass the resistance check.
A really good spell. If you put it on a particularly tanky target like an ogre, putting it on a basic unit is a waste, since the spirit damage is likely to kill them before they can do anything. This means it's not great in every situation, but it can still swing a lot of fights to your favor, since most strong enemies won't be able to resist this spell.
This is probably the best capstone of the original specializations. It isn't overpowered like Blood Wound, but it can make a lot of difference in a fight. It can even end the fight early, allowing your party to revive and heal, since if the only enemy left is blood controlled, they count as an ally, and the fight ends. I would say A tier.
It has a contention for S tier, but I guess unlike Blood Wound, there's times when it isn't the right call to use, so A tier it is. Finally, on to the 2 awakening specializations. First off is the Keeper specialization, which is one of the few spell trees that deal nature damage and also has pretty good crowd control spells. The first spell is one with nature, which creates a forest around the caster that slows enemies and deals constant nature damage while they are inside the field. However, this spell prevents the caster from moving while it's active.
This spell is a cool idea, but in practice it's pretty terrible. The damage of this spell is not strong, and unfortunately, since it's nature damage, and this spell is only available in Awakening, this doesn't mix, since most enemies in Awakening are Darkspawn who have nature resistance. The area one with nature reaches isn't as big as you would like either. For example, this spell is half the length of Blood Wound. And the slow isn't really appealing unless your mage is going to run up to enemies first. Honestly, they should have doubled or tripled this range, since this ability is only available at level 20 anyway.
The vegan elves hold another L with the presidents. Put this trash in D tier theirs. Plenty of better specializations to put your point into.
D tier is a little harsh. This isn't a waste. It's just not at all optimal. I would say C tier is a good place. Next up we have Thorn Blades, which requires one with nature to be active to use. This spell summons giant thorns around the forest you create with 1 with nature and knocks back any enemies that are in your 1 with nature area out of it. This spell also deals decent physical damage.
I can see the vision the developers were going for with this specialization. They wanted to create a safe space for a mage so they can build up threat, but be safe since they have this area no enemy can penetrate. They are slow in the area, then they have a spell that pushes them further back if they get up to you. But the size should have been far larger or the damage cranked up higher, since this spell doesn't save 1 with nature, so it can join it in C tier.
The knockback is larger than some other spells, but yeah, this is an easy D or C tier, especially for being unlocked later in the game.
C tier it is. And next up we have Replenishment, which is a passive ability that improves one with nature. Any enemy that dies in your one with nature field heals you by 20% of the damage your field does.
This is the last spell that ignores Blood Mage's debuff. But again, one with nature doesn't deal enough damage or has a big enough range for this to be useful. I'd give this D tier for a 3rd point investment, just healing and not improving the damage, or area makes this not worth it.
D for Dalish, just like all this trash belongs boys.
Donald, you are a D1 hater, but D tier seems like an appropriate place for this. It improves upon nothing. That actually makes one with nature better. Now on to the last spell, and the capstone, and I have to say, Nature's Vengeance is pretty good. Just like every other spell, one with nature must be active before you can use it. But the range on this spell is double one with nature's range. And the damage is physical, so you end up getting far more value. The spell's range is as large as Blood Wound, but centered in an area around you. And just like Blood Wound, there is no friendly fire, and the targets are stunned for a few seconds, unless they pass a resistance check. The damage, however, is instant and pretty damn good.
If all the spells were this good, the Keeper specialization would be a strong contender to compete with the others. However, despite this spell being a similar Blood Wound, it still is slightly weaker since it only goes off around you, instead of being able to determine where it goes off.
I'm glad you guys took the time to use this spell because I know I wouldn't have bothered put it in B for bad.
Yeah, you're welcome, Double D. Well, on to the last specialization before we get into the other spells. The last specialization is Battle Mage, which is a master of all elements. The first spell is Draining Aura, which is an active spell that creates a field around the user that deals a small amount of spirit damage per second to any target in your aura and gives that damage as health to the Battle Mage.
A short and simple ability, the damage isn't amazing, but it is spirit damage, which most enemies don't resist. And unlike most sustained spells, we have talked about mana is only used when you damage an enemy. Not every second it's active, so it's more economical than most spells.
This is great if you pair it with Arcane Warrior running like the true tank main you are and heal while doing whatever other damage you want to do. That should make it A tier alone.
It's A tier for fun, but on harder difficulties, the damage isn't great. I think it's a solid B tier spell overall. Next up, we have Hand of Winter, which arcs a wave of cold around you in a medium range, damaging and freezing all enemies around you. Now you might be thinking, isn't this just Cone of Cold? And it is, but it has 3 major improvements. First of all, it's arched all around you instead of just in a cone in front of you, so the range is longer. Secondly, it does far more damage. And third and most important, this spell doesn't have any friendly fire, so you don't have to worry about your allies getting frozen.
This spell is really just a flat-out upgrade to Cone of Cold, which is already one of the best spells in the game. This is easily one of the best spells to spam. It freezes enemies that get too close to your mage, offering some crowd control and safety for your mage.
Kinda lazy to just make a better Cone of Cold, but just like Draining Aura, this spell rewards your mage for getting right in the middle of the fight. And it has no downside since there's no friendly fire. A simple but powerful S-tier spell.
Yep, no arguments here. Now we have Stoic, which is a passive ability that activates anytime the mage takes damage. You restore mana equal to 50% of the damage taken. This on the surface doesn't sound great, but pair it with Spirit Healer, Arcane Warrior, or both. And this is a pretty good way to be self-sustaining.
The mana restoration also activates when you damage yourself with blood magic, making blood magic even stronger, since you can restore all your mana back while using your abilities.
This is basically reverse blood magic if you think about it. So ironic it pairs so well with that specialization, but just like everything else with Battle Mage, if you're running Arcane Warrior with heavy armor while you run Draining Aura, this shit is nuts. I would say put it in A tier. It isn't game-breaking, but it is useful.
You got it. And to finish off the specialization spells, we have Elemental Chaos, just like Draining Aura. This is an active spell, and you can only have one of the two active at a time. The damage is the same as Draining Aura, but since it rotates what type of damage, it has the possibility to do more or less to enemies.
I'm sort of mixed about this. On one hand, this makes you feel like a master of all elements, and it's bound to hit a weakness on any enemy you face. So it's always a safe pick for every situation. But in the same breath, not many enemies have spirit resistance, and Draining Aura does the same damage while healing the player. So I think Draining Aura is the better pick, which means this thing should be ranked the same or lower than Draining Aura.
This spell definitely isn't C tier, but since the damage is equal to Draining Aura without the effect, let's put Elemental in B and raise Draining to A tier. And now we can move on to the regular spells. The first one is Arcane Bolt, which every mage except Morrigan gets, regardless, which means it's kind of weird to rank it normally, since you likely won't have to use a skill point to get it. And the damage is just always okay while costing almost no mana. Any objections to throwing it in B, boys?
Nope, sounds good to me, Joe. It's the definition of an average spell. Not good, not bad.
Don't grab this shit unless it's free. Call that shit a Costco sample.
Your fat ass would compare spells to food. But moving on next, we have Arcane Shield, which is an active ability that gives 10 defense plus 10% of your total spell power. This is nice early on, but there's so many better ways to defend yourself than a small defense buff.
Yeah, Arcane Shield is okay in the early game, but in the early game, you should really start getting some of your key spells ahead of a small defensive spell. And late game, the defense buff really won't matter, since it's only 10% of your total spell power.
The move isn't broken and it doesn't do damage. Throw it in D tier.
With pleasure. Next, we have Staff Focus, which is a passive buff that increases your staff damage by 33%. Not bad, since there will come a time you will have to just use your staff for damage, but most staffs do less than 10 damage, which means this is only a +2 to staff damage.
Yeah, if you run out of ideas and have a few extra points, it isn't terrible or useless, but it's just incredibly underwhelming.
This whole tree is just goddamn mid. Put it in C tier since it doesn't have a downside.
Next up, we have Arcane Mastery, which is another passive skill. This just gives you a flat 5 spell power, which for a capstone just sucks. And any later game, staff or robe gives you far more spell power. No objections for D tier boys.
Nope.
Sounds good, boys. Next up, we have the last of the awakening abilities. First off, we have Fade Shield, which is yet another passive ability that gives a +5 spell resistance and passive dodge. It also passively increases your Arcane Shield, giving you an additional 15 spell resistance and dodge when Arcane Shield is active, which actually makes Arcane Shield pretty good. So do we need to rethink where we put it, boys?
I think if Fade Shield was in the base game, I would put both of these spells in B tier, since it's a pretty good defense boost. But considering you can't unlock this till level 20, and in Awakening, I think throw this spell in C tier, and keep Arcane Shield with a disclaimer that if you get both of these, they are B tier. So just like Staff Focus, if you're out of ideas on what to give your mage in the late game, grab both of these. It's not terrible.
Upgrading them doesn't stop them at the end from being trash. Throughout 90% of the game, for how late you get them, they should be even more powerful.
Fair enough. C tier. It is. Next up, we have Elemental Mastery, which you would think is part of Battle Mage, but I guess not. This is an active spell that increases all elemental damage. The mage does by 15%, which is pretty damn good.
15% of all damage you deal is solid for a second tier spell. If this was Origins, this would be S tier. But considering how late you get this, they could have gone harder with the damage bonus. So this is just overall pretty average.
It buffs your damage and makes your fireballs hit harder. It's all you can ask for in a spell. Give it an A tier.
I think A tier is appropriate. It's a useful spell, good for any situation, but it's not game-changing. Next up, we have Attunement, which is a passive ability that gives +10 willpower and magic, as well as +2 to mana regeneration in combat, which is stronger than the Arcane Warrior Capstone, and of course stacks with it. I think this is another A tier, but I could see it being added to S tier for the additional skill point buffs.
I'm torn here, but considering this ability gives more ability points than any late game awakening item, I think you can make an easy case for a S tier, but definitely a low S.
This shit just gives you everything you could ever want, and I don't see a reason to not grab it. So S tier is appropriate.
Sounds good? And last up, we have Time Spiral, which when used, resets the cooldowns of every single other spell, besides Time Spiral. For long-term fights, this spell is game-changing. This is an easy S tier, especially since it works with every single build you are running, whether you're damage dealer or a support mage. Being able to spam your spells faster is always good.
Yeah, the fact this works in every build means there's never a reason to not grab it.
Put that shit in S. Only way it could be cooler is if it reset the whole team's abilities, not just the mage using it.
Last awakening tree here, boys. We have the Repulsion tree. The first spell here is Repulsion Field, which is an active spell that pushes back any enemy that enters the shield and uses mana every time it pushes back an enemy. Not when it's active, like Draining Aura. However, it doesn't do any damage.
If the move doesn't do damage, it's useless. It worked with acoustic 5-year-olds playing Pokemon Red, and it applies to Dragon Age. Put that shit in D tier.
Yeah, knockback alone isn't a rare or powerful condition this late. And the fact it doesn't do damage means I have to consider it worse than Thorn Blades. Also, unlike every other knockback ability like Warcry, this spell doesn't reveal stealth at enemies. That alone should put it in D tier. Don't bother wasting mana on this spell as the extra negative. The sound effect is annoying.
Good thing me and Donald are half deaf on that aspect. Next up, we have Invigorate, which is another active ability that decreases fatigue by 20% to everyone in an area around the mage. This on is mid as hell. But the fact it can stack if you have multiple mages means you can greatly reduce the cost of your spells and abilities if you wanted to.
It's an interesting setup since you could possibly get up to 60% spell cost reduction from this ability alone with 3 mages. It's not exactly broken since mana isn't a huge issue in the late game, but it is nice. I say it's B tier with the stacking feature alone.
Honestly, boys, you're missing the financial gains with this as always since you are not on that grind. Blood magic already reduces the base cost of spells, plus 3 stacks of Invigorate means you are flinging spells around for almost no cost. You can flat out ignore lyrium potions at this rate with how much value you get. I would give this an A tier with enough setup.
That is pretty cool, but if you have to set up all that, it's still a huge point investment. But I will still throw it in B tier. Next up, we have Arcane Field, which is really just Arcane Bolt on crack. This is an active spell that creates another field. And every 4 seconds in this field, Arcane Bolts are shot out at every enemy in your field. The big brain combo with this spell is you pop a force field on yourself, then activate it. So you're immune to damage, but still dealing big damage yourself.
The spell does slightly less damage than an Arcane Bolt, but it hits multiple targets. This isn't a game-ending spell, though. You will have to throw something else out there if you want to finish the enemies. But A tier is fine.
Last awakening spell is Mystical Negation. This is just a better cleanse area from the Templar tree. The spell works like Cleansing Aura from the Spirit Healer tree, where every couple of seconds it releases a wave that destroys all spell effects created by an enemy. This is the improvement, because every other spell that destroys spell effects has friendly fire on it. This is pretty situational for awakening, though. The enemies don't have too many crazy effects, besides a crushing prism or curse of mortality still.
Yeah, it's a really nice quality of life improvement, but it just comes too late. And I would expect more from a capstone that takes 4 points to unlock. I would say this is B tier at best.
It's a cheap imitation of Cleanse Area. Let the Templars remove spells, just keep casting Fireball. Put that shit in B tier. It's just slightly better than mid since it copies Templars.
Finally, we can move on to the 4 main spell schools you will use in base Origins. First off, we start with the most classic school Primal, which is all about element damage.
Okay, Sleepy, you've been on a yap spree for half this episode, but everyone knows the Primal spells. Whether you're a new or veteran player, why don't you let me and Barack handle this one?
Okay, fine. I could use a few inhaler puffs anyway, so go off, Queen.
All right, starting off strong, we have Path of Fire. The first spell in the tree is Flame Blast, which creates an arc of fire in front of you for 5 seconds, and in addition to dealing 50% of your spell power plus 100, it also ignites the enemy, dealing extra damage over time. For a first level spell, it deals very solid damage.
Fire damage is the most hit or miss of the elements undead, and Darkspawn are weak to fire. While dragons and demons resist fire, still more than half the enemies in Origins are Darkspawn and undead, and this is really good damage for a first level spell. So A tier is the appropriate place.
It's hard to not have friendly fire trigger with this ability, but the damage is worth the risk at the end of the day. Just watch your aim and place it in A tier.
All right, next up we have Flame Weapons, which is the most optimal of the 3 weapon spell buffs. This gives a maximum of 20 fire damage to melee weapons depending on your spell power, which is pretty good for clearing through Darkspawn and undead.
While fire is always a reliable element, the damage doesn't really pop off till mid-game, early game. The damage is not worth the mana cost, but I would say this spell is a solid B tier.
The weapon spells are always just pretty mid, but fire weapons are always the best choice for that little extra damage to make fights quicker. So B tier is fair.
Next up is a spell that needs no introduction, Fireball. This deals 30% of your spell power plus 100 in a massive area, and just like Flame Blast, this ignites enemies and grease in the area. On top of all that, it knocks enemies down. I don't care how small the room is. I'm putting Fireball in S tier.
Donald, there's a massive downside to Fireball. You're forgetting that keeps it from being a top tier spell.
I didn't forget, I just don't care. It's called Highball's gameplay, Joe.
Fireball in Dragon Age Origins is the best love note to D&D Fireball I have personally seen in a game. The damage and crowd control is massive in a fight. However, because of friendly fire, you can just as easily wipe your team with a Fireball as wipe the enemy. This, however, comes down to how you use it tactically. I think if the most common enemy wasn't Darkspawn, an undead Fireball would be B tier. But since so many enemies are weak to Fireball, it's an easy choice for S tier. But on the lower end, because it's nowhere near as strong as, say, Blood Wound.
Thank you, very cultured, Barack. Finally, we have the capstone of this tree, Inferno. After a small cast time, you unleash a large firestorm, dealing 40 plus 40% of your spell power every 4 seconds for a total of 30 seconds in terms of raw damage. This is one of the most deadly spells in the game.
Yeah, but because it lasts 30 seconds, that's 30 seconds. Your party can't enter the area you casted it either without likely dying as well. So it's an even bigger double-edged sword than Fireball, and you can even end up prolonging a fight. If the enemies walk out of range of the storm farther away from you, since Inferno, on its own, doesn't have any crowd control, so it's easy to just walk out of.
Joe's right, it's basically a 50-50 toss-up if it works, but when it does work, it's great, so put it in B tier.
I like how you call me haters, but you put one of the most deadly spells in B tier, but fine. Next up is Path of Stone, a very different tree from the other 3 on this list. And starting off, we have Rock Armor, which increases the mage's armor as long as it's up for a maximum of 12 armor. Honestly, this shit is hardly better than an Arcane Shield.
Well, armor is a little better for Arcane Warrior builds, and it's the first spell in the tree, so it's extra armor for only 1 ability. Point C tier is a good place. You're not going to notice much, but this is worth it to make Arcane Warrior stronger.
Yeah, 1 point for a small defense buff is not bad, just underwhelming. C tier is fine.
All right, fine. Well, next up is Stonefist, which I can't lie is pretty good. It's a single auto-target spell that deals physical damage and knocks enemies back unless they pass a resistance check. The damage is 100 plus 40% of your spell power, which is pretty good. Best of all, if the target is frozen or petrified, Stonefist can shatter instantly, killing them.
This gives Stonefist great synergy with its own capstone. As well as all cold spells, even without the synergy, the damage and CC are both solid for a tier 2 spell. I would say this is A tier, a really reliable spell.
It's a good single target spell that can't miss and gives you all you could ever ask for. A tier is perfect.
Well, A tier it is, can't go wrong with free damage. Next up, we have a spell that doesn't do damage for some reason, and that's an Earthquake. This spell has the same area of effect as Blood Wound, and it slows enemies down by 40%, as well as causing them to slip if they don't pass multiple checks. Everything here, however, affects allies as much as enemies.
On its own, Earthquake is almost never the right spell to cast. It's just as likely to make your allies useless as make the enemies useless. This does pair better if you have a firing squad set up beforehand, or if you cast one of the storm spells on top of it. Still on its own, it's actually detrimental to use. So I can't really put it higher than C tier.
The other issue with this spell is if you cast it on targets that won't move, like mages or archers, this spell doesn't impact them in any way. D tier would be appropriate, but I guess in some instances, this spell can be clutch, so it's not a total waste.
Finally, we have the capstone Petrify. This is another single target spell that completely encases the target in stone for 20 seconds or less. Depending on the rank of the target, they also need to fail the resistance check. While they are petrified, they are able to be shattered, which is a one-hit kill. This is a solid spell since it's the easiest way to get a shatter kill in the game, but for a capstone, I would expect more than a possible kill on one target.
The problem with this spell is it's only used as a shatter setup, since just stunning one enemy in the fight isn't anything crazy. There are first-level spells that can do that just as well as Petrify. If you could shatter certain bosses in the game, this would make Petrify S tier, but really you can only use it on Elite or lower. Effectively, it's handy, but not crazy. I would say B tier.
There's something to be said about the perfect symmetry Stonefist, and Petrify have it's always good when one tree gives you a good combo. But the combo, like you both said, is mid. So B tier it goes since it's never bad to use, just not game-changing.
All right, next up we have the Path of Ice, which is a good mix of damage and crowd control here. Starting off good, we have Winter's Grasp, which is one of Mommy Morrigan's starting skills. The spell is a single target spell that does 100 plus 36% of your spell power, and it lowers the target's speed by 20% for 5 seconds. It's a good spell, but how could it not be since Morrigan is the one using it?
Winter's Grasp, like almost every other spell in this tree, has a chance to freeze the target completely after casting. The percentage chance is based on the rank of the creature, and if they are frozen, just like Petrify a critical hit, or Stonefist can shatter them, considering how low a cooldown Winter Grasp has. This shatter happens more likely than you would think.
You really can't go wrong with any single target spell in the game. They are simple but never bad to use. Winter's Grasp is a solid A tier. It is just as good as Stonefist.
All right, but next up is Frost Weapons. And I'm going to give 2 reasons why you should put this in D tier. The first is that you can only have one weapon spell buff at a time. So this takes away from fire weapons, which are statistically more useful in an Origins run. And 2, the damage maximum of cold weapons is only 10, which is half of fire weapons, and the minimum damage is lower too. There's no reason to take this over fire and telekinetic weapons.
Agreed, that must have been an error, since there's no way that was intentional.
I always forget that cold does half the damage fire does in terms of the weapon buff. It's just sad, put it in D tier. Don't use this over the other 2 weapon buffs, viewers.
All right, but next up we have a much stronger spell, Cone of Cold. This spell is the cold version of Flame Blast. This deals a flat 34% of your spell damage to everyone in the arc and slows their movement by 40%. But that's only if they don't get frozen, because unlike Winter Grasp's percent chance Cone of Cold is a resistance check to freeze, which means you are far more likely to freeze enemies to set up a shatter.
Cone of Cold's freeze is always double that of a freeze than Winter's Grasp, and even if the target is immune to cold damage, they aren't immune to being frozen to set up a shatter or just stun them. There's also a glitch that can be beneficial if used right. The resistance check only applies to targets that are in the initial arc when the spell is cast. If someone walks into the cone while it's already going off, they will auto-fail the check and freeze. So if you see an enemy running up to you just out of reach, you can make some high IQ plays.
The freeze also can save party members from grabs like the Ogre and Broodmother grab. That combined with that glitch make it S tier, along with Fireball again. Just make sure you aim well.
Since you all agreed to Fireball, I will be fair and put Cone of Cold next to it. Last up, we have the Capstone Blizzard, which is the cold version of Inferno, creating an ice storm for 30 seconds. But the damage is calculated differently, dealing 10 plus 10% of your spell power every 2 seconds, which means mathematically, Blizzard deals half the damage of Inferno.
Yes, but there is a really big reason for that, Donald. Blizzard has the same CC effects as earthquake, causing enemies and allies to be slowed and slip if they fail. The resistance check. Additionally, anyone in Blizzard for 4 seconds will auto-freeze for the same length as Cone of Cold. Your party, on the other hand, are immune to being frozen solid from Blizzard, and instead are just vulnerable to the slow and slipping. That fact alone makes this easily the best storm spell of the bunch. Even if they are immune to cold damage, they can still become frozen in place to set up a shatter.
This, just like Blood Wound, is the perfect mix of crowd control and damage. I think if the damage was a little bit higher, this would be S tier. But as it is, I think it is high. A tier, boys.
All right, enough of you all glazing the cold spells. Let's move on to the last tree in Primal, the Path of the Storms. First off, we have Lightning, which is a single target spell that does 100 plus 30% of your spell power as lightning damage, which means it actually does slightly less damage than Winter's Grasp.
Electrical damage, just like in Skyrim, has the additional effect of dealing mana and stamina damage. In addition to the regular health damage the spell will deal. While nice, there are plenty of other methods to take out a spellcaster, then slightly draining their mana so that effect is hardly noticeable. Plus, it's hard to determine how much mana an enemy might even have. This is a common trend with all the lightning spells. Unfortunately, they sacrifice the raw damage of the fire tree and the crowd control of the cold tree for the niche of stamina and mana damage, which is never worth it compared to most other spells in its tree.
It's still a good single target damage spell that can't miss. I would stick it in B tier, since it's slightly worse than Winter's Grasp.
Sounds good. Next we have Shock, which is the electrical version of Cone of Cold and Fire Blast. You shoot lightning out of your hands like you're a damn Sith Lord, dealing 100 plus 40% of your spell power as lightning damage. It's kind of cool, but it doesn't have crowd control, and it's less damage than a Fire Blast.
Throw it in C tier, honestly, unless you have something, Joe.
Now, if you want good shocky fingers, go play Force Unleashed or something. C tier it is.
All right, and next up we have Tempest, which is the lightning version of Blizzard and Inferno. Kind of interesting, this storm spell is the only one that isn't a capstone. Tempest damage is the same as Blizzard, dealing 10 plus 10% of your spell damage every 2 seconds for 30 seconds, which is still half of Inferno's damage.
While, yes, Tempest on its own is pretty mid, I think it's finally time we start talking about spell combos. If you have Spell Might equipped on a mage and cast Tempest on top of a Blizzard, or vice versa, they combine into a new Spellstorm of the Century, which deals 40 plus 40% of your spell power every 2 seconds, which means this storm is double the damage of Inferno. It does get rid of Blizzard's freezing, but if the enemy was already frozen by Blizzard, then they are cooked.
Storm of the Century does just auto-win almost any fight or boss you're in, assuming you can keep them in it. But obviously, any party member that is in Storm of the Century is just as dead as the enemy. Storm of the Century might be the strongest spell in the game in terms of pure damage, but you do need to set up 2 storms that have cast times and invest 10 ability points, which is nearly half the total points a mage gets just to unlock this, so it's really impractical. I would say if even one of those caveats was less, we could justify Tempest and Blizzard in S tier. But as it is, put Tempest in B tier. It has a lot of problems on its own, and Storm of the Century has a high cost and isn't usable in every fight.
All right, and now we have the Capstone Chain Lightning, which is an auto-target spell where after a cast time you fling a lightning bolt that deals a flat 20 damage to a target before bouncing to a nearby enemy target. And each time the main lightning bolt bounces, it sends out additional smaller bolts that hit other targets. All of these bolts can hit up to 10 people. and the damage is determined if you can hit the maximum of 10 or not.
If it can hit everyone, this deals a maximum of 120 damage per person, or 1,200 damage in total. This is damn good. But you have to be able to hit the maximum, which isn't feasible in every situation. Also, this is one of the only spells not affected by spell power, which means its damage later in the game is pretty mid. I'm not sure if this is a bug or not, to be honest.
Chaining Lightning doesn't have friendly fire, but it is situational. And late game, because it doesn't have any scaling, makes it kind of mid. I would say B tier, honestly, though that's mostly because it's capstone, so it should offer more than just flat damage.
B tier's fair, and just like that, we are done with the cool powers, and now on to the support tree creation. Barack, you want to take the lead on this one? Almost none of these spells do damage, so I don't care.
All right, sure thing, I guess. Well, first we have the healing tree. And first spell on the list, if you can believe it, is the heal spell. This spell can be cast on a single ally unit or yourself, and heals that ally by 100 plus 40% of your spell power, no matter what build you are running. This spell is always a must grab, especially since it's first on the tree.
If you don't have a mage with the Spirit Healer specialization, this is the only way, besides potions and regeneration, that you can heal your party. And those two are absolutely the only way to heal allies that aren't in your party, which is essential in some quests, like Redcliffe, to get the best outcome. This is an easy S tier. It's always good to grab this on every mage since it only costs 1 point to get.
This shit comes in clutch if you chug a lot of potions like Gamer Sups. Not that I would know anything about that, but even I can agree this spell is top tier. Unless you're doing a no healing challenge, S tier it goes.
Very cultured boys, next up we have Rejuvenate, which just like heal can be cast on any ally. But unlike heal, it can't be cast on yourself. This increases the stamina or mana regeneration of the target by 8 for 10 seconds, which is pretty high. But stamina or mana regen is usually never going to be your make or break. Everyone okay with C tier?
Definitely mid, move on.
Next up we have Regeneration, which is the same targeted spell as heal, but instead of a flat heal, this spell gives healing over time, equal to 100 plus 20% of your spell power every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. However, because of the heal cap on regeneration, spell power doesn't really impact this spell. Still, this is really solid healing, but a flat heal is more beneficial at higher difficulties, unless you are a tank.
What makes the spell useful compared to heal is that it ignores blood magics. Heal debuff, the same as Lifeward. Regeneration also ignores Curse of Mortality, which can come in clutch when fighting Darkspawn. I would give this a solid A tier.
I wish you two told me that during our playthrough, but thanks for the late heads up. Give it A for assholes then.
Last up, we have the Capstone Mass Rejuvenation, which is like a group heal. But for mana and stamina regeneration, it increases stamina. And mana regeneration by 5 for 15 seconds for all party members. While this is better than Rejuvenate mana, or stamina regen is never a make or break in most cases. And this one needs 4 points, not 2. So let's put it in C tier.
Just put the healing on the health bar, little bro.
Next up, we have the Heroism tree, which is all about buffs. And starting off, we have Heroic Offense, which gives 100 plus 10% of your spell power to a selected ally. No maximum on this one, so it's good at lower and higher levels.
This is perfect to slap on your main damage dealer. The damage is nice, and it's a good buff for a first level talent.
Finally, the mages can buff the base Templar players. Sounds like a perfect A tier. The damage isn't going to solo the fight, but it is solid all the same.
Sounds good, boys. Next up, we have Heroic Aura, which, when casted on an ally or yourself, gives you a flat plus 30 to missile deflection. This is an okay buff. But this only affects arrows, so it's not really going to have a noticeable impact in most fights. Any objection to D tier?
I didn't even know what missile deflection was till you told me Barry D tier is valid.
Perfect. Next up, we have Heroic Defense, which is the defensive version of Heroic Offense. This spell gives an ally a defense bonus equal to 100 plus 20% of your spell power, elemental resistance equal to 100 plus 10% of your spell power, and physical resistance equal to 100 plus 10% of your spell power. This isn't as absolutely broken as Shimmering Shield, but it is still really good. Just like heroic offense, it isn't broken though.
It's not as broken as Shimmering Shield, but it can be cast on your non-mage tank, and that makes whoever is supposed to take the hits just better. Definitely going to give this A tier with heroic offense.
Again, these spells finally give the warrior players some good eats. No complaints for A tier here.
Finally, we have the best quality of life, spell buff, in the game haste, as this tree's capstone. This spell increases your party's movement speed by 30% and your party's attack speed by 33%. This is essential for traveling around towns or backtracking through dungeons for items you missed, and the attack speed buff greatly increase your party's DPS.
This is a must-grab on any playthrough I'm in, even if we ignore how convenient this spell is. The attack speed and movement increase is still a strong buff, and it's permanent as long as the mage who casted it is up. Haste can also stack to give even more value to this spell if you have two mages.
There is the attack speed cap, but still stacking haste is convenient as hell. This is a no-brainer of a S-tier spell.
Halfway through creation. Now let's get to the glyph tree. First off, we have Glyph of Paralysis. This spell places a glyph trap on the area the mage selects, and when an enemy steps on the glyph, they are stunned for up to 10 seconds, depending on the rank of the creature. This spell is also considered a trap, not a spell, so magic resistance doesn't affect whether the stun goes off or not.
For a first level spell, this is really good. Crowd control. The stun is really long early on. And even at later levels, most enemies can't resist it's a solid A tier, simply for being available for 1 point.
Crowd control isn't as good as killing them, but these stuns feel like they last a year, so I can't argue with A tier.
Next up, we have Glyph of Warding. You summon a glyph, and as long as an ally is on the glyph, they gain an extra 30 defense bonus, a 50 increase to mental resistance, and a 30 to missile deflection.
This is a mixed bag, because you have to stay on the glyph to get the bonus, so your melee units aren't ever going to have the benefits of this spell. However, you can pair this with heroic defense to really stack up a high defense bonus. Just put this down by your mage and have her huddle up next to Liliana.
Cringe.
With a bow, it's a good safe space for you and your waifu. I would put it in B, since heroic defense or Shimmering Shield is better. But this is good value for low cost.
Thank you, Joe. Next up, we have Glyph of Repulsion, sort of a combination of the first two glyphs in terms of use. While this glyph is active, any enemy that runs into the glyph is knocked back outside of the glyph unless they pass a resistance check equal to your spell power. After they are knocked back, the enemy is slowed by 40% for 2 seconds. Allies, however, are unaffected by this glyph and can run freely through it.
The fact that the check is based off your total spell power means if you have a good item build for your mage, a lot of enemies are going to be knocked back. You can also glitch an enemy into permanently being trapped in the glyph while you kill them if you place it in the right spot. The power of this spell alone depends purely on your map and game knowledge in the right hands. It is A tier, but that's not the only reason.
I was wondering when you two would get to the good shit when you cast Glyph of Repulsion on top of an active or inactive Glyph of Paralysis. The glyphs disperse and create a paralysis explosion in the same range as a fireball. Since Paralysis Explosion uses spell resistance instead of physical or mental resistance, a lot of bosses are vulnerable to this spell too, which makes clapping them up easy money. Just like Fireball, you have to watch out for friendly fire since the spell will paralyze you for just as long it paralyzes the enemy. But if you don't have a skill issue, this is just another reason both these spells belong in A tier.
On the other side of things, next up we have Glyph of Neutralization, which when cast immediately drains the mana of any target standing on it by 1 million.
Sounds like a reasonable number for a small loan.
Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Donald. The target also cannot regenerate mana while on this glyph. And it is also immune to all spells except Crushing Prism for some reason. Crushing Prism just keeps them on the glyph, though it still doesn't do damage. Honestly, I don't really know what the major benefit this spell is supposed to have. Sure, it may stop an enemy mage from casting spells, but you could do that by simply stunning them or hell, even killing them. The fact that the target becomes immune to spells basically makes it so you can't kill them and they can't kill you. Automatic D tier, especially since it's a capstone spell.
It does have funny interactions with enemies like Arcane Horrors, who are supposed to always use mana, but that's still not worth an ability point in your build. D tier, it goes.
All right, last up on creation, we have the Nature Tree. And first up, we have Spell Wisp, which gives 100 plus your spell power times 5% as bonus spell power and stays up until the effect is turned off. Or the mage dies pretty good for a permanent buff and a first level spell.
There's no cap on the spell power increase, which means this gets better with levels. Just make sure you slot a tactic to always have it on. There's also a way to pair this with another spell we will cover later to stack even more spell power on your mage, but even on its own, spell power affects almost everything you do. So more of it for low cost is top tier, definitely an A tier spell.
It helps you do more damage, throw that shit in A, then.
Next up, we have a fan favorite spell, Grease. This conjures a pile of grease conveniently in the size of a fireball. Enemies and allies that step in the grease are slowed by 50% and have the possibility of slipping if they don't pass a check. So this spell is already statistically better than Earthquake, and it's a tier 2.
The real fun shit happens when you use a fire spell or firebomb on the grease. In classic D&D style, the grease will ignite, still giving the grease slow, but now dealing a small bit of fire damage every second.
It's so damn effective. The enemy darkspawn and mages do it all the damn time to you, Donald, in our Origins run. But while this is 5 whole ability points for one combo, I have to agree. The combo is really good. Definitely put Grease in B tier, it's good fun. But the spell combo is not as deadly as many others.
Next up, we have Spell Bloom, which gives mana regeneration in a large area. Normally, I would say put this on C tier with the other mana regeneration perks, but this gives mana regeneration and stamina regen to enemies as well. So it's actually at the bottom of D tier for giving enemies a small buff while also being mostly useless.
Now I'm making a new tier just for this perk called How Tier because this shit is actually treacherous. Viewers don't use this.
Honestly based, I didn't even know it buffs enemies. Someone was on some good shit when they made that spell.
Finally, we have the Capstone Stinging Swarm. This is the only spell in the base game of Origins that does nature damage. This spell summons a swarm of insects that attack a target of your choice, dealing 100 plus your spell power and nature damage over time for 10 seconds. If the target dies, while the swarm is attacking them, it resets its timer and finds a new target. It can do this up to 10 times maximum. While this sounds devastating, unfortunately, Darkspawn resist nature damage, and undead are immune to nature damage. So there's only a few enemies this will work on.
This is probably why it is the only nature damage spell in Dragon Age Origins. Nature damage just doesn't cut it. Still, it's a single target spell that has the potential to do more damage than Chain Lightning, and it doesn't have a charge time. I would say give it B tier at least.
Agreed, a solid B. And now we go on to another spell school that barely does any damage, Spirit.
Well, I wouldn't say barely, Donald, but let's get into it first on the list. We have the Spell Warding Tree, and the first tier spell is Spell Shield. This is a weird one. This creates a shield around the mage that has a 75% chance to absorb spells, and instead of taking health damage, the spell damages your mana instead. However, this ignores any other possible spell resistance you have. If you don't have enough mana too, you will always fall under the effects of the spell. It's an okay defense, but there's definitely better options a mage has in Origins.
It's nice because a mage has more mana than health, but the fact this can still fail if you're unlucky, and it drains your mana pretty quickly, keeps it from being high B tier is fair.
Just don't get hit with spells, bozo.
B tier is fair. It's okay if you use it or don't. Next up, we have Dispel Magic, which removes all magical effects on one target of your choice, good or bad.
This could be considered a better cleanse area, since instead of dispelling everything in a large area, you dispel a single target. It really does just depend on what you need dispelled.
Nothing is better than the Templar specializations. Those are clear S tiers, but this cheap copy can go in B tier. It's okay.
I suppose B tier is fair. You're not going to need to use this every single fight. Next up, we have Anti-Magic Ward. This spell can be cast on an ally or yourself and creates a shield around them which ignores all magical damage and effects harmful or good. This can be really clutch to throw on your warrior or rogue to get in the fight and ignore the biggest bulk of the damage they would be taking.
This sounds amazing on paper, but there's a huge downside. The spell doesn't list, and that's that you are not immune to the secondary effects of spells, just the damage part. So if you get a fireball thrown on you, you would still get knocked back. If you don't pass the check, you just don't take damage. Same if you get Crushing Prism thrown on you, it still protects you from damage, but it's not perfect. I would say it's a solid B tier again.
Everything in this tree just seems mid as hell, honestly. This is why I ignore Spirit in general.
Finally, we have the Capstone Anti-Magic Burst, which is just a cleanse area, but on a target area of your choice instead of spewing around the Templar. Honestly, as much as this might sound Donald Pilled, I don't see why you would take this instead of just using a Templar to disperse the bad effects you wanted to take out.
Yes, Barack, become Templar pilled. Here I have this trash can, want to help me find a mage, baby?
Just put it in C tier, it's worse than Mystical Negation, but not worthless either.
Sounds good. And next up we have the Mana Drain Tree. This tree is going to get us yapping. But let's deal with the first spell, since it's the simplest, which is Mana Drain. This spell drains 20 plus 20% of your enemy's mana and converts it to your own mana. And if you throw a vulnerability hex at them first, it combos draining half of their mana instead.
This is an okay top off, but it doesn't take out enough mana on a target to matter in a fight. And also, lyrium potions exist, so just throw this in C tier.
Agreed, just drink your Mountain Dew voltage instead.
Next up we have Mana Cleanse, which is supposed to heavily damage the mana on an enemy spellcaster. However, this spell is bugged and ends up increasing the mana on an enemy, not damaging it. You could use this to deal more damage with Mana Clash. But that doesn't really seem necessary, so this will also go in How tier, boys.
Agreed, don't betray your homies, boys.
Next up, we have Spell Might, which works the same as Spell Wisp, except it's 10% of your spell power plus 100 as increased spell power, and it also hurts your mana regeneration. This is definitely going in A tier, but you want to go over the exploit. Joe?
Sure thing, Barry. So viewers, if you cast Spell Wisp on yourself first, then cast Spell Might, the additional spell power from Spell Wisp will apply to spell. Might, then you can recast Spell Wisp, and your spell power will increase even more. You can't stack this infinitely to reach some kind of you-guy-o protagonist moment, but it is a nice little buff. Easy A tier.
Infinitely topping yourself off is crazy, but a win is a win.
Now we have one of the most infamous spells in the game Mana Clash, which can be summarized as a Kill Mage's button. This spell drains up the mana of a target and uses all that lost mana back into spirit damage. The damage calculation is probably the most complex of any spell in Origins, being the total mana loss times 0.5 plus 1% of spell power. But complex or no, this will end up killing almost anything that has mana, or at least taking out 90% of their health. Even bosses can be one-shot with this ability.
This ability doesn't just one-shot mages, but it also works on demons and arcane horrors, which still aren't the most common enemy type in the game. This spell absolutely cheeses a lot of fights, but then is useless on other fights, I would say about less than half the time. This spell is useful. Taking out the mage in a major fight can really make a game-changing impact, but at the same time, there's plenty of fights you simply can't use it more than, say, Fireball or Blood Wound. Also, the fact this is a capstone means you have to invest a lot of points to reach this spell. I honestly think it's A tier based on the rankings, boys. It makes a lot of fights brain dead easy, but then in some fights you won't even notice the difference.
I think it could go either way. Here, Mana Clash is broken, and killing mages in the fastest way possible is glorious, but there's plenty of strong bosses, like the High Dragon fight, Sir Catherine fight, that this spell doesn't make any difference in compared to a lot of our other S-tier spells. I think the very top of A is the right call. It's amazing, but not game-changing in every situation. And you have to use up a lot of this mid-tree to get it, but I could say a Fireball fucks up a mage as much as Mana Clash. Also, next up, we actually have a tree that does damage the Necromancy tree, so I can take lead on this one. All right, first in this tree, we have a fan favorite, Walking Bomb. This is a targeted spell that deals 100 plus spell power over time for up to 20 seconds or less, depending on rank. If the target dies before the duration ends, they explode in a massive blood bomb, which deals the same damage to everyone in an area. It not only looks cool, but it can heavily damage an enemy squad if you detonate it right.
The downside of this spell lies in the threat mechanic. The damage is amazing, but this spell generates up to 100 threat on the mage who casted it on Nightmare difficulty. This means the person you put it on is likely going to beeline it immediately to you and likely explode, damaging you instead of the enemy. Unless you're an arcane warrior, this will likely kill you.
You can avoid this with plenty of crowd control of your own or threat generation from a warrior, but we can't really rely on that when ranking this spell. I think despite the good damage and fun of the spell on a Nightmare playthrough, this spell is B tier. You really need something else in your build to get the most out of Walking Bomb.
Y'all are haters, but whatever. Next up, we have Death Siphon. This spell gives all the enemies you kill the good suck.
Phrasing, please.
Every dead enemy gives you 8 plus 8% of your spell power as mana back. This is just another simple sustain spell. I don't see why you can't drink a lyrium potion instead.
Yeah, this is more C tier fodder with the rest of the mana regeneration alternatives.
Next up, we have Virulent Walking Bomb, which is just Walking Bomb on crack. The damage is increased by times 1.5. And when you detonate the bomb by killing the target, every enemy caught in the blast has a 50% chance of Walking Bomb being casted on them, which means you can carpet bomb every enemy you are facing.
Goddamn, Donald, I love it when you talk dirty. The explosion is amazing and the damage is top tier. The threat is ironically less on higher difficulty too, only drawing 70 this time despite the damage greatly improving. This is a definite improvement in two major ways. I would say an easy A tier.
Yeah, the friendly fire is still too massive to give a clear S tier, but the improvements are everything you could want in a higher tree spell.
Last up, we have the Capstone Animate Dead. This spell can be cast on a dead enemy, which will summon a skeleton companion that will be 75% of the mage's level, with 2 of the spells that the enemy knew in life. They have limited tactics, but will follow you around until they die again or you enter an area with a load screen.
You can also combine this with Spell Might to create a summon that is 90% of your player level rather than 70% and gains an extra ability using this method as well. This spell is pretty bad. It's rare you can even get it to summon the correct enemy you want, and you can't control their tactics either, so the summon will have to be micromanaged, or just stick to an extra auto attack bot. I would say this is D tier. It would maybe be C or B if it wasn't a capstone.
Yeah, investing 4 points to get this spell is cool thematically, but in terms of synergy or usefulness, this spell is not worth the mana you used to summon it, not even to say all the points you used to grab the spell. D tier it goes.
Last up on the spirit list, we have the Telekinesis Path. The first spell in this tree is Mind Blast. This sends a stun wave around the mage that lasts around 3 to 4 seconds, but it depends on how many hit and the rank of the enemy hit.
This also resets your threat on any enemy hit by Mind Blast, which pairs great with spells like Fireball and Walking Bomb. Just make sure you run away from the enemy after casting it, so you're not the nearest target when they are unstunned.
The threat reduction and clutch saves make this a easy A tier. For a first tier spell, it's always worth getting in the early to mid game.
Next up, we have Force Field, which can be targeted on enemies or allies. The spell lasts for 18 seconds, times the target's rank modifier if it's an enemy. When the force field is up on the target, they are immune to all damage and can't deal damage themselves or move a true safe space that all liberals salivate over.
It's a safe space that you can control at will, and the uses this spell can have are insane if you're a tactical player. Sure, the obvious use is to shut down an enemy mage you don't want to deal with, or protect your mage from a fatal kill. But you can shut down an enemy's grab ability, put it on your mage after casting a walking bomb, put it on your tank after they cast taunt, or put it on Shale during Stone Aura to keep the effect going. There's rarely a reason this won't be good, and you can even dispel force field early with a cleanse area, or dispel if you really needed to. This is an easy S tier.
Okay, making thick girls, Shale, and warriors better convince me S tier it goes.
Good shit, boys. Always amazing when you two can agree.
Next up, we have the last of the weapon skills in Telekinetic Weapons. The difference in this one compared to the other two is instead of raw damage, This spell gives armor pen equal to your spell power up to a maximum of 13 to all melee party members. This pairs great with two-handers, as much as I hate to say it, since two-handed strength increase your armor penetration further.
This is already better than frost weapons, but unless a two-hander is your main hitter, I would say the pure raw damage of fire weapons is better. A solid C tier for this one. It has its uses.
No complaints here. All the weapon spells are just mid anyway.
Finally, we have probably my favorite non-fireball or Templar spell-crushing prison. Or rather, it would be my favorite if enemy mages didn't constantly throw this shit at my wife and POTUS.
Skill issue.
Screw you both anyway. This spell creates a cage on a target enemy dealing 100 plus your spell power times 1.25 divided by the total duration, which on average is 5 seconds depending on the enemy rank. If the enemy is a lieutenant or lower, they will also be immobilized while taking this damage. This is usually enough damage to one-hit kill anything lower than a boss.
The fact that there is no normal check for the stun, just a check for the rank, is already something that sets it apart from most spells. Even if they are too high of a rank, they will still take the spirit damage, which means there is no reason to not use this spell in any fight. At worst, it's good damage, and at best, it completely shuts down a strong enemy.
The spell also has two combos. It can cause shattering in frozen or petrified, which is sort of a waste of the spell, but you can, and the stronger combination is Shockwave, which activates when you cast Force Field and Crushing Prison on the same target. This instantly breaks both spells and sends a shockwave that deals 50 plus 50% of your spell power as physical damage and knocks all enemies down. Unless they are immune to knockdown, just like Crushing Prison, there is no check. And the fact that Crushing Prison pairs with a spell in the same tree makes it worth every point to grab and solidifies S tier for Crushing Prison and Force Field.
Good shit, Joe. And with that, we are finally at the last spell school. After a damn hour, we've reached the entropy tree. Why don't we each take one of these trees to share the load?
I would love to share my load with you.
Phrasing, please.
I will go first, Donald. First tree we have is the Chains of Entropy tree. The first spell is Weakness, which is a single target spell that inflicts an enemy with a -10 to defense, attack, and movement speed for a duration depending on rank.
This isn't bad for a first level spell, but it's hard to notice a massive difference either. I would say it's somewhere in C tier, honestly.
I could see a case for B tier, but the fact there's no increase based on spell power makes it mid. C tier it is.
Next up, we have Paralyze, which is a targeted spell that paralyzes the target unless they pass a resistance check. And if they do pass, they are slowed instead. Not bad, but Glyph of Paralysis is just better, since it's much less likely to be resisted, and it's a tier 1, whereas this is a tier 2.
Paralyze is still nice, and it usually isn't resisted. I would say this is a solid B tier.
There are much better ways to paralyze, but this isn't awful.
Next up, we have Miasma, which is a sustained spell that gives the same effects as Weakness, but in a massive area, around the mage to every enemy. Considering this is just a weakness that affects multiple people and doesn't increase any of the debuffs themselves besides making them a little slower, I would say it stays in C tier with Weakness.
Agreed.
Finally, we have Mass Paralysis, the capstone. This spell sends out a paralyzing wave in a fireball radius, where after a charge time paralyzes every enemy in the area.
It's important to note, paralysis explosion from the glyph tree is far faster than the cast time of mass paralysis. However, mass paralysis has no friendly fire, so it's a little easier for new players to use still for a capstone. I shouldn't have to debate if a spell combo that costs less points is better or not. So I will give it a safe B tier.
Considering the cast time of the spell, you would think the spell would be way stronger, but I guess Chain Lightning proved us wrong there too.
True enough. Well, I will take the next tree, which is the Hexes tree. And first on the deck, we have Vulnerability, Hex, which decreases every elemental resistance of a target by 100 plus 30% of your spell power, which means everything your mage does damage-wise will hit harder, and even your allies with elemental runes will hit harder.
Damage over time spells need to be placed after the Hex is applied, but that's the only caveat here. The best part is there is almost never a resistance to Hexes, so you can throw this on bosses to increase their weaknesses further, Like a high dragon's weakness. To cold, it's an easy B tier. It's a good effect.
It buffs warriors and is usable on bosses. B sounds perfect.
Next up, we have Affliction Hex, which has the same stats as Vulnerability Hex, except it lowers elemental resistance by 20% of your spell power instead of 30. But the upside is everyone in a massive area is affected by this debuff, which ends when the target dies. This is a top-tier improvement in every way from the first spell.
This spell is way better once you learn to not kill the person you afflicted the hex on. Making everyone weaker to your damage is a real game changer. I would say this goes into S tier. There's never a reason to not use this spell since it's rarely resisted, and it's great value for a tier 2 spell.
I think it's closer to A, honestly, but I see your point.
S tier it is. And next up we have Misdirection Hex, which is a spell that causes the target to miss all normal attacks. And critical hits, the target lands hit, but only as normal attacks. This lasts for 20 seconds.
This is a good way to take a high damaging enemy out of a fight, and it even can work on bosses like Revenants. There are a few abilities like the Ogre's Charge Attack or the Bear Slam that always hit. However, I would say this is still A tier. It's nice and noticeable, but it's not usable in every situation.
I agree, this spell is more annoying when it's thrown on our player character rather than a game changer when it's thrown on the enemy.
Last up we have the Capstone Death Hex, which is the inverse of Misdirection Hex. This spell lasts for 10 seconds, and while active on an enemy, all attacks landed on the target are critical hits.
This is nice with the right build, especially if you have attack speed buffs like haste, but this doesn't feel as deadly as it should be, especially for something being a capstone called Death Hex. I could take or leave this one personally, but I could settle for A tier.
This probably should have lasted longer or had a secondary effect for a capstone, but it's still really good. I would say a solid A tier. Next up, we have the Mental Contamination Tree, which is the goated tree we had on Mommy Morrigan in our Origins playthrough. First up, we have Disorient, which lowers the target's attack and defense by 5 for 20 seconds.
This is just weakness that lasts longer but has lower debuffs. I think it can stay in C tier with weakness, honestly.
Agreed, let's get to the good spells.
Well said, Barack. Next up, we have Horror, which is a single target spell that causes a 10-second crash out unless they pass a resistance check.
The good thing about Horror is the stun goes off mental resistance, which not many enemies have, so it's more reliable than Paralyze, and you can attack the enemy while they are stunned and it won't break the hold. It's a solid A tier spell. For only a tier 2, it's good crowd control.
Yeah, A tier seems fair. It also has synergy with other spells in the tree we can cover in a minute.
Next up, we have Sleep, which is a massive area of effect spell that puts every enemy hit to sleep unless they pass a check for 12 seconds. However, if they are hit, they immediately wake up.
Most demons undead and Sylvans hit by this spell resist the effects entirely, however. The highlight of this spell is the combination with Horror. Casting Horror on someone who is asleep creates the Nightmare combo, which breaks them out of both effects, dealing 100 plus your spell power and damage. This can instant kill most enemies from the mid to late game. I would say thanks to the strong combo, give it A tier.
Sleep's crowd control is pretty mid, but it's a mid stun that is hard to resist and hits a large amount with no cast time also, because Sleep pairs with Horror, and the capstone in this tree, it makes all 3 of these spells worth the point investment.
Finally, we have the Capstone Waking Nightmare, which we have definitely glazed up in our own playthrough. This spell has half the area of sleep. Instead of putting them to sleep, if they fail the check, they have the chance to either be stunned, fight each other, or become your ally for 20 seconds, depending on their rank. If they were put to sleep, they auto-fail the Waking Nightmare check.
This spell completely turns the tables on the one advantage enemies usually have on you, which is numbers. Turning their numbers against them is just goated, and the perfect way to set a fireball or something to finish them off, since damage doesn't interrupt the spell.
There's never a reason to not use this spell. It breaks enemies out of stealth. It is reliable, and it has combos on its own spell tree, easy S tier.
Last tree to go, you awake enough to take us home sleepy?
I'm locked in next, and last tree is the Entropic Mortality tree. First up, we have Drain Life, a single targeted spell that deals 20 plus 20% of spell power as spirit damage and gives the damage back as healing to the caster.
It's good damage that never misses and gives sustain, a easy B tier.
It's good, but not great. B tier is fair.
Next up we have Death Magic, which works the same as Death Siphon. But for health, each dead body restores 100 plus, spell power times 10%. And Death Magic and Death Siphon don't work together at all. A body will either restore mana or health, not both.
This spell doesn't give good sustain with blood magic or good sustain period. Nearly every healing spell is better than this.
Smells like a D tier spell to me, boys.
Next up, we have Curse of Mortality, which is Donald's biggest enemy in our playthrough. This spell puts a curse on one enemy that deals 100 plus spell power times 50% spirit damage over time. But the more important effect is it prevents healing from any source besides HP regeneration when the curse is active.
This spell is goddamn S tier when it's used against us, but I can't remember more than 2 or 3 bosses that heal, and even less normal enemies that have healing spells. Because of that, the anti-heal effect is a mythical pull to get it to work for yourself. So really, you're grabbing this for the damage over time and nothing more.
Most healing is not a big deal, or has an alternative way to handle it. In game, I would give it C tier for a 3rd level spell that deals single target damage with no stun. Ironically, if this spell was in Dragon Age 2, it would be S or A tier, since enemies use potions in that game on harder difficulties.
C tier it is, and next up we have the final Capstone Death Cloud, which is a storm spell that does spirit damage. The damage is 10 plus spell power times 10% every 2 seconds, which is the same as Blizzard in terms of raw damage.
Unlike Blizzard, this doesn't have crowd control, but just like Tempest, this does have one spell combination called Entropic Death. Casting a death cloud on someone with a death hex, the hex immediately erupts, dealing 200 plus 2 times spell power to that target, which will almost always kill them instantly. Probably the most single target damage you can do to an enemy in one sitting, but this also the most point costly combo in the game, costing 8 points in total. Still, just like Tempest, this combo is strong, so I would say this is B tier.
A mid-B tier spell, what a way to end, but holy shit, 1 hour later, and we finished, boys. I never want to talk about the pissant mages ever again, but I now know what spells to use in our Awakening series.
Viewers hope you enjoyed something different and get hype for Awakening after a brief hiatus while our editor takes a vacation.
We consulted our Discord members for how to go about this tier list, so a special shout out to them. If you guys want previews, Dragon Age discussion updates from our editor, and even this tier list that our editor will post after this video goes live, then you can join link down below. But for now, don't forget to like and subscribe to Thumb My Ass. And if you made it this far, leave a comment. If you can't think of a comment, then just comment on your favorite spell in Dragon Age Origins, and we will see you all next time. But for now, stay safe. Biden out.